neurological conditions. Today, we are going to specifically focus on adolescent development. Dr. Miller and I chatted about this topic, and we both believe it's a very fascinating topic and very relevant, hopefully, to many individuals that are attending this webinar. And I just want to say in advance that I think I'm pretty good with technology, but if there are any blips, please forgive me in advance. So just to go over what we're going to be discussing today, we're going to, like I said, talk about adolescent brain development. So at the end of this is what you should essentially come out understanding. You should be able to describe how the brain develops during adolescence, understand the influence of genes and the environment on adolescent brain development, as well as risk and protective factors during brain development. And then hopefully you can utilize this knowledge to develop effective approaches to support the development of adolescents' thinking. So it's kind of one of those things that if we have a greater understanding of how adolescents think, we may be able to better help. So I said that we're going to talk about brain development. We're going to start off talking a little bit about adolescent decision making. I want to give you a little bit more of a tangible example of what happens, what's actually the function of what's going on before we go into the anatomy of what's happening with the brain. So we're specifically going to discuss the rationale for this talk and what makes adolescents so distinct from adults. So in order to do this, let's start by discussing some really interesting research on emotional recognition. I know, it's a little scary. Sorry about that. Good thing it's not first thing in the morning. Boo. So adolescents and adults think differently. They may look very similar, especially if an adolescent is grown, 18 years old, may look really similar as an adult. We may treat them similarly as an adult, but they're very different. So let's go over this practical example. So there was a study conducted examining adolescents and adults in which they were given a series of pictures and asked to describe the emotion. So this would be an example of a picture, and they're asked to describe, is this person shocked, afraid, angry, happy? Essentially, what emotion is this person experiencing? And the results were really, really interesting. So just to give a little bit more background information, the adolescents in the study were 11 to 17 years old, and then we had adults over the age of 25. In addition to asking about the emotion, they did brain scans. So if you came to the developing brain, I think it was part one, maybe we talked a little bit about imaging analyses, but essentially they took pictures of the brain, and then they actually looked at the function. So where the blood flow was during this task, okay? So that indicator tells us what part of the brain is active. And what they found was really interesting. They saw very distinct differences between the adolescent or teenager, I'll probably use those interchangeably, and the adult. So without going too much into anatomy right now, you can just look at those brains. Don't look at the size of the brains. Honestly, the pictures just aren't to scale. The size are pretty even, so don't worry about that. But look at the regions, where it's lit up, okay? So we see that in the adolescent brain, the subcortex, or the lower brain, we're going to talk about that more coming up, is activated. In the adult brain, it's more of the frontal area. And we're about to talk a little bit more about the frontal area. This frontal area is really, really what makes such a distinct difference between adolescents and adults. And what we see by this image even is that there's this drastic difference. So on average, adolescents are using a very different area of the brain to complete this task. And what else is really interesting in terms of understanding the emotion of the picture, what the researchers found was in adults, 100% of them were getting it right. So they were getting the emotion of the person correct. In adolescents, the accuracy was more like 50%. So they were misinterpreting the emotions of the person. This is a very tangible example of how different adults and adolescents are in terms of reading and responding to situations. And this shows in some cases adolescents may be reading and responding to situations incorrectly. So before we go into the brain stuff, let me just kind of take this into a practical example. So as an adult, you may get mad or upset as an adolescent and say, like, surely the child or the adolescent knew I was upset. Surely they knew how important this was. But maybe surely isn't the correct word to use there, because they may have been reading your emotion incorrectly. So they wouldn't be reacting the way that you would expect them to. The same thing could be the case if they think that we're upset and we're not. They're reading the situation possibly differently than we would read the situation, and they're reacting based on how they're reading it. So we're going to go into both of these structures in depth, but the frontal lobe is an area of the brain that is still developing in adolescence. So we could see in the previous picture, I'm just going to go back, that the adults are really utilizing that frontal lobe when they're determining the emotions, and the adolescents aren't. It's not fully developed there. This part of the brain is really important for emotional recognition. It's important for higher order behavior, such as planning, organization, decision-making, voluntary movement, and speech. The amygdala, we think of as, it's developed earlier. So we're going to talk about development. It's essentially develops from the bottom to the top. So this is more of like a bottom structure, and it's more of based on reactionary. So if we were to see a bear in the woods and it would scare us, this would be a part of the brain that indicates fear and that we should run away. So it's more reactionary as opposed to us applying critical thought to the actual situation. So just to get a little bit more into the frontal lobe. So I like to think of the frontal lobe being responsible for a bunch of different tasks that all fall under this umbrella of what we call executive functioning. So our brain development extends to around age 25. Obviously, this is an average, and it's not the case for every single individual. We do know some of those adolescents that are a little bit more skilled in these behaviors than others. Some are a little bit more behind. But so on average, this area of the brain is really still developing until age 25. And that's really interesting when you think about it, because we have adolescents making such important decisions before this age. And if I think back to my experience, and I know everyone's different, and maybe it's one of those confirmation bias that I know this, I don't think I had fully matured until around this age. I thought I was fully mature. I thought I was making the best decisions, but I really feel like things snapped more into place and I really got it more around age 25. But again, everybody's a little bit different. And maybe it's that, like I said, confirmation bias. I know that brain development usually goes till this time. So I'm like, yeah. Every decision I made to age 25, let's just void that. And let's think about what I did after age 25. And then most of this development that's happening later in adolescence is occurring in the frontal lobes. And it's really important for these, I don't really want to coin it as adult decisions, but these decisions and actions that take real critical thought, planning, organization, decision-making, impulse control, and attention switching. So let me give you some examples of what we may see in adolescents if their frontal lobe is not fully developed. So these are just some examples. And I imagine this may hit home with some of you if you're working with adolescents, or if you have adolescents in your home. So adolescents may have these challenges because of the underdeveloped frontal lobes. That includes difficulty planning a project, possible struggles with telling a story, like a coherent story from beginning to end and all of the details in between, trouble communicating details in an organized manner, difficulties with mental strategies for memorization, trouble generating ideas independently, trouble initiating tasks, and difficulty imagining these consequences of a decision. So we'll just give you a second to reflect and think about if any of this hits home to you. And possibly, I mean, for me, when I learned a little bit more about this, it created a little bit more of an understanding for me of patience with adolescents, when I had a sense for, okay, yes, they are making these decisions, but their brain's still going through a lot of changes at this time. So it's just definitely something that we have to work with them on. Okay. So I'll give you a second just to think about that. All right, there is your little breather. And now we're gonna go into the fun anatomy component of this. So hang on tight. All righty, so we're gonna talk a little bit about adolescent brain development. We talked about brain development obviously in depth in the first two webinars. So if you attended, some of this may be a review for you, but I don't think it hurts to hear it again because a lot of this information is quite complex. So if you Google, this is a researcher out of UCLA that put together this image in his research. His name is Paul Thompson. But if you put together, or if you Google like adolescent brain development, this is a really common picture that you see. This is a structural image over time, looking at the amount of volume in the brain as a child progresses from around 5 years of age to 20 years of age. And I don't expect you to, understand all of this in depth and all the different, colors and structures and everything that's happening. I think the main point is here is that there's drastic changes. We used to think that, 0 to 3 was the most important part of brain development. Like listening to Mozart, reading books, cognitive stimulation, all of that. And it is extremely important. So is the prenatal time. However, we cannot neglect the importance of the rest of the time. And that includes middle school, high school, on to college. So all of these times are really important for brain development. So if there's any takeaway from the slide, it's just to think about that there are these drastic changes going on. So it's not like, okay, we help a child, we're playing a Mozart, all this cognitive stimulation, playing with them, and then we're like, all right, see ya, you're on your own. I don't think anybody in here does that, but it's just important to recognize that this is still happening. And we're gonna talk about different stages in which this happens more and less, okay? So this slide may look familiar if you have come to a previous talk. Some of this will be review, but we are really going to focus in on adolescents now as opposed to children, which we were really focused on before. So 4 important things to know, and we're going to go through the details of each one of these, but brain development is sequential. I talked a little bit about that so far. So basically from the bottom to the top, from the back to the front. I'm going to explain more so what that means, how it's developing. And this will give you an understanding too of what children and adolescents are capable of doing at different stages. Change is use dependent. So it's that what we've heard, use it or lose it, particularly during adolescence. This is going to be really important. We'll talk about why. Organization is based on experience. So what you're engaged in. I just said, cognitive stimulation, reading books. There's mixed research on Mozart, but it was just an example. But the way that your brain is organized is based on all of these experiences that you have. We're going to talk about that, and we're going to really go in depth into the interaction between what our genes are telling our body and how experience is shaping that. And we're going to talk about critical windows. So what are really important times for different functions to develop throughout childhood with a specific focus on adolescence? So the first point is that brain development is sequential, okay? So we're gonna focus on that for now. The brain grows from the bottom up, the inside out. What I want you to do right now is to make a fist. Hold your arm up, like up above you, like you're making like flexing for someone, like look at my muscles. So we're going to come back to this fist model, but what our fist really displays here is the brain. So we're going to talk about the brain in terms of this fist. Our brain is a little bit bigger than our fist, but nonetheless, I still think it gets the point across. So, alrighty. So the lowest, remember, bottom to the top, inside to the out. The most primitive parts of the brain, what's known as the brainstem, is developed first, and this is in utero. And then the more complex areas develop from there. And if we think about that, that really makes sense. So we need those primitive functions that include, heart rate, breathing, regulating all of those autonomic functions in our body. We need those to survive. So if those aren't working, the rest of it doesn't really matter. We need to get that done first before we can focus on planning our route to the doctor's office, So we have to have that in check. And so that happens the earliest. We go from that physiological part to the emotional development, and then to the cognitive development. And if we think about it, emotion and cognitive really have to go hand in hand, because you can be very emotional, but your reaction is really going to depend on how you can regulate that cognitively. And then that middle stage, like if you look in between that cerebral cortex, cognition, limbic system, emotion, if you go like in the middle of that, that's kind of where adolescents are falling. So there's this like discrepancy between this emotional center being developed, but the cognitive center not being fully developed. So we're going to start at the bottom. So we start with the physiological development. It's in a little red box off to the right. I tried to highlight where in the brain I'm talking about. So if you have your fist model, it's like about where your wrist meets your fist is where I'm talking about. These structures in this general area of the brain is crucial for sustaining life. So the brainstem is going to perform these autonomic or automatic functions like breathing, heart rate, body temperature, sleep and wake cycles, digestion, sneezing, coughing, vomiting, and swallowing. And think of it, we need all of this stuff. This stuff comes before the emotion and the cognition. So when we think of the brainstem, we really think of survival. And a full-term baby has a brainstem that's fully functioning at birth. It enables them to breathe and for their heart to beat. And it also controls some of their reflexes. So this is where we are now. This developed way before adolescence, and thank goodness it is, okay? So we're kind of moving away from this portion. We're getting more into the limbic system, cerebral cortex, which is going to be more paramount in terms of development during adolescence. So the limbic system is really the emotional center, and that's what houses the amygdala. That area of the brain that we saw that was activated in the adolescence, I guess it could be coined pre-adolescent too, between 11 and 17 years old. This was the area that was active. So in the limbic system, it contains a complex set of structures that lies just in between the cortex, okay? So, and it's like underneath the main cortex. That cortex is that bumpy portion. So if you open your hand and like what's inside, that's your limbic system. So let's think about it in an example of your limbic system at work. Think about something that has been really embarrassing in your life. Unfortunately, we probably all have those things that have happened before. But picture where you are, what's around you, what was happening. As you're imagining this, do you feel any changes to your body? Your palms getting sweaty? Is your heart beating faster? Are you blushing? If you're feeling any of this, I mean, you may not be because I'm moving really fast, but you can kind of imagine this feeling. This is an example of your limbic system at work. It's really that emotional control center there. It includes some structures that you may have heard of in the past: the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, which we talked about. And it's really responsible for emotional life, and it has a lot to do with formation of memories. These structures are present at birth, so they're there. In a full-term baby, those structures, they're there, but there's a lot of developing that's happening throughout childhood and adolescence. So our regulation of emotion from childhood to adolescence really switches. This regulation switches from being more of a shared responsibility, so in conjunction with your parents or caregiver, to an individual responsibility in adolescence and adulthood. This process requires new connections to be formed between the cognitive center, which we're going to talk about, the cortex, and it's responsible for higher level thinking, and these emotional areas throughout the brain. So this ultimately, these connections that are being formed in adolescence between this emotional center and the cerebral cortex can lead to an adult level of decision-making, planning, and thinking. And while all of this is happening and their emotional center is developing, the structures in the cerebral cortex are still developing. So there's this mismatch and the merging of the connections between the limbic system and the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex is our cognitive center. So in regards to our fist model, it would be the knuckles, so the bumpy part. It's the outer layer of the brain, essentially. So it's what you see if you look at a brain. This can be thought of as our thinking brain. We use our whole brain for thinking, but this is where a lot of the thinking comes from here. If you're studying for a test, this is really helpful for that. It's very complex, and typically we think of it divided into 4 parts, which are called lobes. We're going to talk about all of those individually and the path that they take in terms of development. This cerebral cortex can change into the 20s. We know that the frontal lobe, really the changes are happening up until about mid-20s, which we had discussed. And we see this development when children go from childhood to adolescence to adulthood. So they go from managing these basic functions like potty, then managing emotion, like crying, and then cognitive development. And yes, some cognitive development is obviously taking place at an earlier age than adolescence, but that's really the sole thing. They have the other things down. They have the going potty, those basic functions down. So on the bottom right, you see the divide of the cortex into the lobes. I want to talk a little bit about each of these lobes and what occurs in terms of development in adolescence for each of the lobes. So the purple area is called the parietal lobe. It's important for processing a lot of sensory information and essentially putting it all together, okay? So sensation like touch, pressure, pain, temperature, and texture. It's also really important for posture and spatial orientation. So what's really interesting about this area is we see something pretty different than we see in the other lobes. This area typically peaks around age 11 and then declines. So when they're younger, they may be noticing things that adults may not notice. The occipital lobe is really important for processing visual information. And this area, although it is towards the back, it is developed at birth, but there's still some ongoing development that takes place until the 20s. So it's not fully developed when, say, for example, they're driving and they're being asked to process a lot of visual information at a time. That's why teens, yes, they're still learning to drive, and so there's definitely a process that comes with that, but also no cell phones, no music, all of this. They're processing a lot of information, you know, from all different senses, and they're still developing that processing of visual information. So the frontal lobe, which now you've become familiar with because I've talked about it so much, but it's really our focus here. It's the last part of the brain to develop, and I hate to say this, but often the way that we think of the functions of this is we think of what adolescents lack. So, and I'm not saying they lack this totally, and I'm not saying all of them. Uh-oh, I am really sorry. Told you to, technical stuff may be out of control. Alrighty, so they may be lacking such things like, I was going back to saying that this is not always across the board. There are definitely a lot of adolescents that are more mature than others, and I'm not saying they can't do this, but they're still working on it. Their brain's still developing this. So problem solving, inhibition, abstraction, multitasking, organization, planning, and there's a lot of research to support this altered thinking in adolescence. So an example, there's research in criminal justice. So if we think in terms of crimes, even if they commit an adult-like crime, there's a lot of debate on what should be the punishment for that crime, because they may commit a crime similar to adults, but they may not totally grasp the reality of that crime because of brain development. Last but not least, we have the temporal lobe. It's really important for memory formation, the processing of information, and it's a critical area for the storing of auditory information. And this continues to develop into late adolescence. So this is really important for processing auditory information. So you may ask a teenager, like, did you even hear me? because it just may not seem like they're listening. And yeah, they may have heard you, but are they actually listening? And some of this could be due to the development of the parietal lobe that's still taking place. I want to talk about a couple other areas that are very much developing in adolescence. And I'm just going to, it may seem a little bit random, but their development in adolescence is really important. And this isn't a neuroanatomy class, and we don't have hours and hours and hours, so I'm not going to go into every single region possible. I just want to talk about a couple. So the cerebellum, there's my arrow. So it's kind of the back of the brain. Sometimes it's referred to as a fifth lobe because it's so large and it hangs out in the back there. It kind of looks like a lobe, but it's not. It's important for coordinating body movements and also coordinating brain activity. It's kind of like a supercomputer, like helping to put everything together. And this continues to develop until about age 23 to 25. Let's take an example of a figure skater or a gymnast. Often children will have the raw ability and the skill in childhood, but if you watch, say you watch the Olympics, I know I'm guilty of watching both during the Olympics, figure skating and gymnastics, but over time that raw skill can still be there, but they become more sophisticated and graceful with their movements with age, okay? So that is due to the development of the cerebellum. And then also, if we think about that grace and sophistication developing, the same things are happening in the brain in general due to that activity of the cerebellum and the development of that. The corpus callosum, which is not as much a structure, but it's a band of connections that separates. It doesn't really, well, it separates, but it also helps connect. So it's like the line that goes in between the left and right hemisphere. So in the brain, it's essentially divided into the left side and the right side. So when we think of our lobes, we have a right parietal lobe, a left parietal lobe, a right frontal lobe, a left frontal lobe, et cetera, et cetera. So it divides and connects the two hemispheres. So it's like that dividing line, but there's areas in there that serve to connect the two. It's important for creative thinking and creative problem solving and processing complex information, essentially sending information back and forth from one hemisphere to another. It continues to grow throughout pregnancy. It allows someone to look at things multiple ways. So like looking at things logically and emotionally. So putting that limbic system with the cerebral cortex kind of together so that they're thinking about something as a whole instead of individual parts. And it helps coordinate this thinking. This coordination isn't really in place until mid to late puberty, and it takes a while to develop from there and for adolescents to really grasp those skills. So that's a little bit into Neuroanatomy 101 of the development of the brain throughout adolescence. So hopefully this gives you an understanding of these functions that are still rapidly developing during this time, and then others that are already in place. So we talked about how the brain development is sequential, and now we're going to talk about how it's use dependent. So the human brain is really a use it or lose it organ. So the brains have the ability to grow and the ability to change. We've already talked about how they have the ability to change. These functions develop, the structures may be there, but the way that it works changes over time. Scientists use this term called plastic because plastic can be moldable. So at one time, scientists thought that the brain was pretty much fixed at age 10 or 12. We now know that this is not the case, and brain development is really activity dependent. And we know that these structures are still rapidly developing until age 25. So we really need to think about that use it or lose it thing. You don't want to just stop engaging in cognitive activity and whatnot, because we're gonna see soon that the brain's really working to keep the connections, keep certain connections and get rid of other ones because it has a lot and it's just trying to organize everything. So essentially this is happening constantly through adolescence. So the brain is molding and changing with the experience that we have and what we are doing for our brain, I guess is the better term. this kind of goes hand in hand with it, but organization is really based on experience. So what you're looking at right now is neuronal connections. We talked about neurons in one of the previous seminars, so if you have any questions about neurons, you can obviously ask at the end, but I also would advise you to go back to that talk because this may make a little bit more sense. But what we talked about in a previous seminar is that we have more connections than we need. We're born with a lot of connections, and then in early childhood, we develop a lot of connections. So we essentially go through these growth spurts of our brain cells and the connections. And you can see during the switch from early childhood to adolescence, these connections are reduced through experience. So the unused areas and what we're not doing and what we don't need are kind of just going away so that our brain can work more efficiently. So the experiences, relationships, cognitive activity that children and adolescents have helps to continuously develop their brains and build these circuits. And these circuits become the foundation for the rest of their lives. So I'm showing you 3 different time periods here. Let's go a little bit more in depth. And it's not set in stone that, this time to this time is when this happening, this time to this time, but it's just an estimate and an average of when these certain stages of neuronal development is taking place. So prenatal to 18, we typically have an overproduction of neurons. So we have this growth spurt. This just highlights that prenatal time up to 18 months is really good to provide stimulation, okay? And then we have this physical growth spurt, this increase. So then we're at like a little bit of a lag. Then we have this rapid increase from around the ages of 10 to 13 where we have this overproduction of neurons. Next, we have what's called pruning, an organization of the neuronal pathways. So after the brain cells have developed, the brain is trying to work to organize those to make the connections more efficient. This is where that use it or lose it comes in, okay? I'm not saying don't work with children that are between the 18 years of 18 months and 10 years. This is just isn't one of the gross words, but yes, all development does matter. Lastly, there are critical windows of opportunity. So there are some times where you really need to focus on specific skills in terms of development for them to develop. So if you've seen studies where children have not had language development because they were neglected and never taught language, and then it's near impossible for them to learn later. So they miss that critical window. So this is just one visualization of what the sequential development looks like and some critical windows of opportunities. And if there are disruptions during these specific times, they may impact brain development. So as the brain organizes, it requires specific patterns of activity at specific times during development. And during these critical times, so if you take a look at language, the structures are developing before birth, and then language development is just crucial, and it's rapidly taking place to 6 years of age. Okay, so that's just one example you can see from the chart. But it's extremely sensitive to input from the environment. So that could be a really good thing if you're working with a child on language, or not so good of a thing if a child is neglected. The critical windows are different for each area of the brain and each neural system and for different functions. Typically, the most basic functions, which we've talked about, hearing and eyesight, are very vulnerable during the early years. And then the complex cognitive processes, although they do start early, they are still, it's still extremely crucial through adolescence. And then this should even extend beyond to the complex cognitive processes are taking place. But this is one example of a window of when it's really important. Alrighty, so the last thing we're going to talk about is genes and environment. We're going to talk about what we can do to maximize our children's and adolescents' experiences. So what essentially can be done to help, And this isn't like a one size fits all model, but essentially like, what does some research say about the intersection of genes and environment that can possibly help for, and in this case, we're talking about adolescents, so an adolescent to have the best possible outcome in adulthood. So the architecture of the brain depends on two things. Well, three. I don't have one listed here. Genetics, environment, and experience, okay? Genetics are going to supply the basic blueprint or the basic plan, provides the structure of the brain's architecture and supplies by means of the interconnecting neurons with and across different circuits. The environment that the brain has to develop in has a profound influence in shaping the capacity of the brain. This begins prenatally with brains needing an abundant supply of nutrients, and any adverse prenatal environment can affect these genetic plans. And what we know now, so like if there's lack of nutrition or if there's chronic stress in a mother, and what we know now is that the environment later, so after the prenatal stage, can actually alter our genes as well. And we'll talk about that. Experience, which isn't listed here, it really refers to the interaction you have with your child and adolescent and what they have with the environment. Healthy and stimulating experience results in brain architecture that's able to possibly, hopefully, operate its full but genetic potential. You can have genetics present, you can have environment present, but the interaction with the environment, if this interaction with the environment, so this experience is prevented, then the brain won't benefit from it. Persistent adversity, both prenatally and post, all of their childhood and adolescence, which is referred to as toxic stress, so we're going to talk about that, can lead to weaker brain architecture and impaired capabilities. So we used to think of it in terms of like genes were distinct from environment, but we know they work together now. Genes give us a range, so the potential capability that we have. The expression is really due to our environment. The way we act is often based on our environment. I'll give you an example in just a second. And it's also evident now in recent research in the field of epigenetics that our environment can alter our genes, and this can be passed on to subsequent generations. My husband was talking about this for a while, that he wanted to, before we had children, he wanted to develop healthy habits and whatnot, because it's actually rewriting your genes. It's helping to recode your genes before we had a child, so hopefully you could pass that on so that would develop with the child prenatally. It's usually not that extreme. It's very subtle changes, but I think the point's still there. And nonetheless, I think it's an important thing to consider that your experiences are actually shaping your genes, and that's actually can shape your offspring in future generations. Not to scare you too much. We all just do the best that we can. So here's this example I was showing of the intersection between genes and environment. Essentially, genes set the tone, okay? So what we have here, I'm actually gonna just bring them all up right now. So there's a gene called the serotonin transporter gene. And if you came to a previous webinar, you've seen this, but like I said, I don't think this is bad to review, because I think this is really important here, because we really focused on children. This is super important in adolescents. So a baby is born with one of three combinations of this gene, and it's based on what they inherit from their parents. So there's short alleles and long alleles, and they're born with one of three combinations of those two alleles. They can develop, S stands for short, L stands for long. So they can have two S's, an S and an L, or two L's. LL, the one at the bottom, the green, is the protective form of the gene. And so what we see from the slope of the line, on the bottom we have abuse or adverse events. So it goes from the left side, no abuse, moderate abuse, severe abuse, and then on the right, sorry, not on the right, on the y-axis, the vertical axis, what we see is depression risk. And what we see in individuals that have LL is that their risk of developing depression is lower and not as dependent on environment. So their risk for depression really stays the same no matter the amount of trauma. SL is considered moderate, that's the red line, so increases based on more trauma. So their risk for depression can increase based on more trauma, And then you see a steeper slope in the blue, or SS. So it dramatically increases based on trauma. This is not a one-size-fits-all, but this is just a tangible example of this intersection between genes and environment. We can't think of this just in terms of prenatal and children. We have to think of this as adolescence too. So much of what is happening in adolescence is shaping the brain in adulthood. So essentially in humans with a short allele, this serotonin transporter gene, if they're maltreated when they're young or in adolescence, their serotonin pathway, which is the neurotransmitter that's really important for depression, it plays a role in depression. In adult life, it's altered, and their risk for depression in adults is sometimes dramatically, well, on average, we see it's dramatically increased. So I mentioned epigenetics. Just briefly, not only do the genes that we inherit affect us, but our environment actually shapes our genes. So we just have to think about that. So how much we eat, how much we exercise, if we smoke, if we had a disease, high stress, they all can impact the way that our genes are expressed, and we can pass this on. This can happen both prenatal and postnatal exposure to stress. These can have long-term consequences in terms of impacting our genes. I'm not going to go too in-depth into this right now. I think it's just something to think about. So this has been shown in both humans and animal models. What I really want to talk about before we're done is stress and trauma. And unfortunately, this is more common of an experience in adolescents than I'm sure we would like to see. So what do I mean? I've said toxic stress. What do I mean? So stress isn't always bad. So say you have an upcoming wedding or baby. We often we're stressed. It doesn't mean it's always bad stress, but it still does raise our body, like certain chemicals in our body up a little bit more. So we do feel it. So it's what we call positive stress. We may have brief increases in heart rate, mild elevation in our stress hormones, but it can help us. It can motivate us. If we don't have any stress and we're going to take a test, we may just like sleep through studying because we don't really care. Tolerable is kind of that middle ground, serious temporary stress responses, but it can be buffered by supportive relationships. So there is some help there. Toxic stress is prolonged activation of the stress response system in the activation of protective relationships. And this is where it gets dangerous. Adverse events like abuse, neglect, divorce of parents, household disaster, death of parent or siblings, all throughout childhood and adolescence, these can activate toxic stress. We see a model from the CDC. I love this model. It came out in 2016, showing what can happen going from, and let's expand this because I've done research in this, it happens beyond childhood. The research I've done is to age 18. So adverse childhood and adolescent experiences can lead to disrupted neurodevelopment. We saw that when we talked about it. Social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, adoption of health risk behaviors can lead to disease, disability, social problems, and this sounds really morbid, but early death. So these experiences we have, and then in the context of a certain genetic code, can be very damaging for individuals. So if we have toxic, this is an example of how it happens. If we have toxic stress, so say that we have chronic abuse, okay? It may influence the stress response system, potentially leading to the amount of hormones that we see that are released. So it's constantly activating this hormone that's supposed to help us, but in the short term. As humans, we develop to react to certain amounts of stress. We see a bear in the woods or we need to protect our family, we react, but not to chronic levels. So it's increasing this hormone or these multiple hormones that can then affect brain structure. The brain structures that it can affect are important for emotions and important for memory. And they include the hippocampus, which is important for memory, and the amygdala, which is important for emotion. This can then change the behavior. So if the structure changes, this changes someone's behavior. It can lead to chronic stress response, so that your system is just adapting to experiencing chronic stress, and reduced resiliency to future events. When you have that reduced resiliency and less ability to calm and cope, it can lead to more toxic stress. So it is this vicious cycle that we really want to be cautious of and intervene if possible and as early as possible. And I'm not saying that everybody experiences stress like this in childhood and adolescence will end up with these massive changes in their brain structure and inability to cope, but the risk is definitely higher in this context. So there's research to show that toxic stress can impact brain structures. So this was a study in 128 adolescents and children. There were 4 different groups. So there was children who experienced early caregiving neglect while living in institutions, or orphaned or abandoned children, children from low SES households, children who were victims of physical abuse, and then children that reported no toxic stress. I say children and adolescents. Each of the 3 groups with the stress, so low SES, physical abuse, neglect, had smaller brain regions in that limbic area than the group with no toxic stress. And what they found, oops, I think one of my slides might have gone away, but I'll explain it to you. So what they found was in the groups that experienced the stress, they had smaller brain regions in regions that were really important for emotion and behavior, and those limbic system structures. And the children with the lower hippocampus and amygdala experienced more behavioral problems. So it was the smaller the volume due to the stress, the higher the number of behavioral problems. So we see that this trickles on into adulthood. So here are just 2 examples of that. So stress in adolescence and childhood can trickle on to adulthood. ACEs stands for adverse childhood experiences. And again, this goes to age 18, so we're not just thinking like little kids here. This was a study in 2004 with over 9,000 adults that showed that 9,000 adults that showed that stress in childhood up to age 18 is associated with increased risk in adulthood. So they have this growth here that the more adverse childhood experiences that you have an increased risk for depression in adulthood. So this is a long-term thing. Similarly, physical health can be impacted by adverse childhood experiences. This graph shows that these experiences can dramatically increase the odds of having a range of physical health problems in adulthood. In this case, it's cardiovascular disease. But these trends also appear for diabetes, hypertension, stroke, obesity, and cancer. So we have an understanding now, and I'm not trying to be too pessimistic, but there are things that we can do that are protective for a child's brain. And having an understanding of the development of the brain and these crucial windows, and that it's still really happening past what we may have thought, we just may think twice about particular behavior or may adapt our teaching or whatnot just to best help adolescents or help them as best we can. So I don't want to end, like totally sad, but what we know is what happens early, prenatally, postnatally, in childhood and adolescence can affect all aspects of development. If our frontal lobe is still developing to age 25, what the adolescent and young adult is engaged in cognitively can affect this development for the rest of their lives. Toxic stress can have a negative impact on the brain development. However, nurturing relationships early are critical, and early interventions are crucial for optimal life course outcomes. And this doesn't just stop when they're not babies anymore. So that is all I have. I'm sorry I got a little fast at the end. I tend to overtalk, and I saw the time and I was a little worried about running out of time. I'm happy to stay and answer any questions that you have, and I do thank you for attending and being an attentive audience.